Hello, welcome to section 1.3, alternative measures to economic well-being. So in this section, we're basically just going to go over some alternative measures to economic development other than income. So the idea here is that income isn't everything. It's a good first step to measuring development, but we don't want to rely purely on income. And one of the reasons for that is if you think about income, it's not really valuable in and of itself. Rather, what you use that income for is what has value. And so it really represents more of a potential. So you can buy things associated with economic well being, you can buy health, education, all sorts of things that improve your living standards, but we don't really know what people are spending that income on. That's why we're calling it more of a potential rather than an outcome. And so, to give you an example of this, here's, four different things. You have a book, a car, an iPad representing the internet, TV representing entertainment. These are all valuable things, but a book is only valuable if you're literate. And there's not censorship, for example. A car is only valuable if there's, a reliable road network, if there's good, fuel availability. The internet's only valuable if it's not being widely censored or that it's not being used to spread fake news and misinformation. Entertainment, again, valuable. But again, does everybody have access to this? Do you have the kind of capability and the infrastructure in place to distribute this to everybody? So we really need to think about income. It's good in the sense that it can acquire things that we care about. But simply looking at income by itself might miss a lot of differences in living standards. So, with that in mind, a lot of development economists have developed some alternative measures of development more based on outcomes rather than based on potential. So, one of them that we're going to go over in a lot more detail in the next module, but we'll just sort of take a brief look at it here, is the Human Development Index, the HDI. So this is something that the UN put together, and it adds to income a couple other outcome-based measures of things like education and health. And so here, if you look at the first three columns, here we've got Botswana, China, and Serbia, which all have roughly the same real GNI per capita. So their incomes are about the same. But if you look at their Human Development Index, and in fact their ranking in the HDI, you see that it's pretty different. Serbia is ranking a lot higher, for example, than China or Botswana. And so when we look at, drill down into some of these outcomes, you can see why that is. So in Botswana, life expectancy is only 69 years, whereas if we look at China and Serbia, it's, almost 8 years longer in some cases. If we look at average years of education, you can see that there's some differences there. But of course, average years of education doesn't tell the whole story. Just because you're in school, what are you actually learning? And so if we look at some more outcome-based measures of education, things like literacy rates, you can see that they're higher in China and Serbia than they are in Botswana. The number of students for each teacher in primary school, and you can see that there's some differences there. Another health-based measure, the under five mortality rate, much higher, for example, in Botswana, about almost 4% of the kids under the age of 5 are expected to die, where it's less than 1% in China and Serbia. Income inequality is a really big thing as well. So a lot more inequality, for example, in Botswana, where the top 10% of income earners are earning 4 times as much as the bottom 40%. Whereas in China, it's half of that pretty much. And then in Serbia, the top 10% earn it just as much as the bottom 40%. Gender equality is, a big one too. And here you can see, for example, in terms of political representation. So in Botswana, it's less than 10% of seats in their legislature, in their parliament, are held by women, where, in China and Serbia, it's certainly not gender equality, but it's a little bit closer, where you have 25 and 34% respectively in China and Serbia. And then, even with the ratio of female to male years of schooling, you can see these countries are roughly about the same. But then we don't want to completely discount income, because if we throw in another country that's much poorer than these three, the Central African Republic, then you can see that this is a country that, yes, they're a lot poorer and they rank a lot lower in the HDI. Life expectancy is way lower. The average years of education way lower. Literacy rates a lot lower. 83 kids per primary school teacher. That's ridiculous. 12% of kids under the age of 5 are dying. More income inequality, less gender equality, especially when we're looking at the ratio of female to male years of schooling. So girls are getting about half as much education as males in the Central African Republic. So again, income is a good first step measure, but especially when we're looking at countries that are relatively close to each other in income, we do want to look a little bit deeper. So I want to bring up something that there's Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen, who was really thinking about what does it mean to be developed. And he came up with three core values of development. And these are somewhat hierarchical in the sense that, you can't really get to the second one unless you have the first one. So the first one is just sustenance. Do you have enough to meet your basic needs? If you don't have that, then these other ones don't really matter as much. Once you reach sustenance, the next level of development is going to be self-esteem. The idea here is, do you feel that your life has a sense of worth and value? Can you make a change in your life? Do you feel that you have sort of the ability, the flexibility to influence your life, those around you, or are you just like a cog in the machine and nothing you do matters? And then finally, do you have freedom? And freedom means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But here, in the sense of development, do you have the ability to pursue what you want to do? So if you are, in extreme poverty, you are barely scraping by, just barely getting enough to eat. You got to take that first job that comes around. You don't really have the luxury of trying out a whole bunch of different things, going to school for a while, figuring out what you're good at. And so you're really kind of forced to just, take the highest paid job that you have. Whereas if you can get to a higher level development, your parents can afford, for example, to send you to college. They can afford for you to figure out what it is that you're most efficient at doing. Now, society's better off when people can do that too, rather than just going for the first thing, because people then will be able to move into those areas where they're going to be the most productive. And so these are why we want to think of development as being able, right? Can we get people just enough so that they are breaking out of that perpetual cycle of poverty? Are we giving people the self-esteem that they feel that they want to work harder because they feel that they can make a change in their life? And then are we allowing people to find out what it is that they're best at doing by giving them the freedom from poverty to make those choices? So you might just be asking, why not just measure happiness? And in fact, a lot of economists do this. They call it not happiness because we have to give it a fancy name. They call it subjective well-being. And so the basic question is this. It's a survey question they give to a whole bunch of different countries. And they say, imagine that you're on a ladder, right? And this ladder has 10 rungs. So at the 10th rung of the ladder, this is somebody who's really satisfied with their life, right? They feel that they can affect change in their daily routine. They've got lots of energy, and they feel like their life's got meaning. The bottom rung of the ladder, that first rung, it's somebody who's pretty unhappy all the time. They feel that nothing they do matters, right? They're constantly being drained by emotional, physical stresses. They're financially worried about everything. And they feel like, their life really just doesn't have any meaning, right? So, given those ranges, people are asked, on what rung of that ladder do you picture yourself? Now, nobody's on the first rung, thankfully. At least on average, countries are not on the first rung. A few are pretty close to the top. And what we observe is that there's tremendous variation in subjective well being, happiness, across, and in fact within countries as well. Uh, and an interesting observation, if we compare happiness to income, is that as we go from the poorest countries to sort of middle income countries, we see that happiness rises pretty steadily with income. But once we get to a level of, your basic needs are being met, so sort of that first core value development that Sen defines, any kind of increases in income don't really seem to cause happiness to go up that much. And in fact, other studies have shown that for sort of middle to high income countries, what causes happiness to go up is not average income, but income inequality. And in fact, those countries that have the least amount of inequality tend to be the happiest countries. There's other reasons that drive happiness as well, and that's something we're going to come back to towards module 3 when we're talking about inequality. But here's what I was just talking about. So this is a diagram where happiness is on the vertical ladder. Basically, this is the average rung that people are saying they're on that ladder, and then GDP per capita on the horizontal axis. And the size of each of these circles represents the population of the country. So there's China, there's India, and then I've got a couple that are marked out here. And so, for example, when we go from Togo to Ethiopia, Ethiopians on average are happier than the Togolese. And that's pretty much due to the fact that Ethiopians are, though poor, richer than the Togolese. And if we keep on going up, you can see that there's a pretty strong positive relationship between income and happiness until you reach the level of income around where Costa Rica is. And then if you take a look at Costa Rica, which is a middle income country, certainly not the poorest, but far from the richest, they are amongst the happiest people in the world. In fact, their happiness levels are about the same of those in Denmark, which is generally considered to be one of the happiest places. And certainly, on average, Costa Ricans, despite being much poorer than Americans, that's this sort of larger circle way out to the right here, they're on average happier than Americans, and certainly happier than even Emiratis, who have an even higher level of income. And so what we can see here is that, yes, there's a positive relationship, but only at pretty low levels of income, right? So there's a couple other things that impact happiness. For example, if you ask people this question on a Monday, They'll probably give you a lower answer than if you ask them on a Friday. So time of year that has an impact on all that. But in general, the takeaway that I want you to get from this is that yes, income increases happiness, but really only at low levels of income. At higher levels of income, what causes happiness to rise seems to be reductions in income inequality. So, and then the last kind of alternative measure to income as a measure of well-being that we'll look at is the Millennium Development Goals. So, in the 1990s, the UN identified a set of goals that they wanted to have achieved by 2000. Now, why are we looking at this 20 years later? It's useful to actually look back and see, what was effective, what wasn't, and they've certainly updated these goals to something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which we'll conclude this section with. The goals were pretty unique at the time in terms of the fact that they were focusing on outcomes rather than income based measures. And there was, on average, they were pretty successful. Now, there's some variations, within countries or between countries, and some goals were a little bit more successful than others. But on average, they tended to be, fairly, successful. Now, that's not to say that they weren't without criticisms. We're going to come back to some of the criticisms of the MDGs. But what were they? Okay, so there are 8 Millennium Development Goals. The first one is eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. So that's the goal. And then they established targets. So the target for this one was reduced by half the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day. That's what the World Bank defined as extreme absolute poverty, and reduced by half the proportion of people who were suffering from hunger. Second one focuses on achieving universal primary education. Basically, that means that everybody who's eligible for primary school, basically of a certain age, should be getting education at least first through, let's say, fifth grade. Third one, promote gender equality, empower women. And so that's the goal, the target. You want to eliminate any kind of gender disparity in primary and secondary education. So boys and girls should be getting the same amount of education. Reduce child mortality. And the target is to reduce by 2/3 the mortality rate amongst children under 5. And so, again, really high rates of child mortality in some of the poorest countries is one of the big reasons why we see large differences in life expectancy. And so, again, an important thing to do. Related to that is to improve maternal health. And so here the target is to reduce by 3/4 the maternal mortality ratio. And so these can be achieved basically by improving the quality of prenatal care, improving the quality of postnatal care, better nutrition for both children and for mothers. So relatively easy things to achieve, but the implementation of this is proving to be a bit challenging. Certainly, there's something we're going to come back to later in the semester when we talk about health policy. Speaking of health, another big one is to combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, other diseases. And so the targets there try to reverse the spread of AIDS, reverse the spread of malaria, so on and so forth. And then finally, they had ensure environmental sustainability. And here the idea, the goal is there. That's great. The targets were a little bit less sort of clear, although some of them were good in terms of try to reduce the number of people that didn't have access to safe drinking water, try to increase the lives of people that are living in slums. And then finally, the 8th Millennium Development Goal was really how are we going to do this, right? And so basically, this was create a global partnership for development is what they called it. And so, what were the targets? You wanted to have an open, rule-based, non-discriminatory trading and financial system. So basically, everybody is on a level playing field, right? So you don't have the rules of the global economic system tilted against the poorest countries that have the least leverage. You want to give, in fact, maybe some special consideration like zero tariffs. So poor countries, the least developed countries, can basically export their goods to richer countries and not have those goods have a tax imposed on them like other countries might. Debt forgiveness. So rather than requiring these countries to keep on making payments on their debt, oftentimes, a really poor country might owe, a couple $1,000,000, which isn't a much to the country that they owe it to, but it's a crippling debt for those really poor countries. And so debt forgiveness is another potential option that's there. Landlocked countries, small island developing nations have unique challenges that they face. And so a landlocked country is heavily influenced by all the countries that are surrounding it because they need to go through those countries to reach other trade markets, other financial markets. Small island developing nations are really subject to natural disasters. They are really isolated. They have really high trade costs. And so maybe we'll give some extra consideration to them. We want to make sure that debt is sustainable in the long run. So we want to make sure that these countries that are borrowing they're not going to be crippled by ridiculously high interest payments and not be able to implement any of their own domestic development policies. Another really important one, you want to address youth unemployment. And so youth unemployment basically is unemployment for people that are like under the age of 25. In a lot of countries, we're talking like 30, 40, 50, even like 75% unemployment rates. This is politically destabilizing. If you got a lot of really young people, and in fact, a lot of these countries, a lot of young people that have secondary education, in some cases, a lot of young people that have university educations, they've done everything that they were told to do. And at the end of the day, they don't have a job. They can't find a job. And really, as a result of this, this is a sort of thing that creates people that are susceptible to, radicalization, susceptible to, political movements where they're trying to overthrow the regime because the rules are stacked against them. The system's not working for them. And so this is a really important consideration. Provide affordable access to healthcare, right? You're not going to be able to reduce child mortality, maternal mortality, if these mothers and their children are unable to afford healthcare. And then finally, something we're going to come back to when we talk about whether or not developing countries are growing at faster rates is there's all these new technologies that are out there that exist. And poor countries can really grow at a fast rate if they can harness these new technologies. They don't need to come up with them themselves, but only if they're able to utilize these technologies. And so we want to make sure that we have new technologies that are being able to be utilized in poor countries. So an example of this is, for example, in Kenya, uh, mobile banking became really widespread. And a lot of people it's pretty much ubiquitous now. I mean, almost nobody uses like traditional brick and mortar banks. And this actually worked really well because everybody had a cell phone in Kenya. And so it was really easy for people to actually just start making transactions on cell phones. And in fact, it's actually probably more advanced there than it is here in the US. And that was an example of Kenya basically skipping the step of going to the brick and mortar banks and going straight towards mobile banking. I'm not really going to spend too much time going over whether or not the Millennium Development Goals have been successful. That's in your Canvas notes. I do want to go and spend a minute on the criticisms of these goals. So the first one is, how are the funds going to get distributed? And so this is a really important question. And it's something we're going to come back to in our very last module when we talk about foreign aid. Right? So you're going to give millions of dollars to reduce child mortality, right? Sounds great. But who are you going to give it to? Are you going to give it to a national government that's maybe inefficient, where there's a lot of corruption and a lot of that money just sort of gets soaked up into the corruption of the bureaucratic system? Are you going to give it to an NGO that has huge overhead costs? And so this is really important that you figure out some kind of method to actually distribute those funds so that they're being used in the most efficient way. Another problem is that a lot of the targets are calculated based off of projecting past growth rates into the future. But things change, right? There's trends that change. We don't know that the rate at which something is growing over the last 10 years is going to be the rate at which it's going to be growing over the next 10 years. And so we might want to be able to update these goals. Another issue is that the goals are not necessarily prioritized, right? So he gave you 8 goals right there, and maybe reducing child mortality is more important than sustainability, right? And we should be giving more money there. I don't know, just hypothetically. Without prioritizing the goals, we're not really, saying that, hey, this is the most important thing that we should do first. The end date for these goals, it needed to be achieved by 2015. Now, you want to have accountability, right? You want to make sure that if something's not working, that it's being held to that standard. But let's say that you didn't reduce the infant mortality rate by 2/3. Let's say you reduced it by half, right? Does that mean that your policy failed? Not necessarily. I mean, reducing it by half is pretty good. You didn't meet your target, but maybe it just took a little while for this program to get off the ground. And if you give it an extra couple of years, it actually could reach that target. Second, next, why is poverty being defined at $1 a day, right? And so this is, at the time, this was the definition of absolute poverty. It's just a nice round number, right? It makes sense. Why not $2 a day? Why not 50 cents a day, right? So there's lots of different meanings towards that. And this is something we're going to circle back to when we talk about poverty in module number 3. But then finally, maybe even more importantly, it doesn't address rich country agricultural subsidies. So for example, the US, Europe, Japan, all heavily subsidize their domestic agricultural sector, right? And there's lots of reasons for doing this. I'm not going to get an argument over whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. However, you have, for example, the U.S. Corn industry that gets heavily subsidized to the point where U.S. corn producers are able to export corn products to poor countries, let's say in Latin America, and undercut the prices by domestic producers in much poorer countries despite much lower labor costs. Now, is this fair? Um, this is a question. It's certainly a challenge to the agricultural sector in these developing countries. Another really important consideration, nothing was said whatsoever about legal and human rights. And a lot of developing countries have atrocious human rights records. And maybe that's important. Climate change, nothing was addressed about that. Obviously, a critical, important thing. And especially because a lot of the poorest countries in the world are projected to suffer the most from global warming, from climate change. And then finally, it doesn't really say much about income inequality, which, as we're going to continuously show over the course of this semester, leads to a lot of really negative outcomes when it's extreme income inequality. Okay. And now, with some of those criticisms in mind, the UN has put together the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is what they're working on right now. You don't need to know these, but basically, just wanted to kind of point out that they have sort of updated them to include a few other things. So here, they're looking at things like affordable clean energy, a decent work environment, reducing inequality, sustainability, responsibility, climate action. Really taking a look, for example, at human and legal rights there. So these criticisms have been taken into account and they have been updated. Okay, so that's the end of this section. That's the end of this section, and stay tuned for a little power play pause it quiz at the end.